So our final speaker within this session, we're now going north up to Norway with Siddharth Sareen from the University of Stavanger, and then we'll have a quick break and some questions. So over to you, Sid.
Thanks. Thanks for setting this up and for pulling together a really exciting bunch of talks and speakers. These are tough acts to follow. And when Harriet asked if I'd like to speak here, I thought it was an interesting opportunity to do two things that I haven't really done in my work on energy poverty so far. One is to speak from a background in development studies. And the other is to, and even though this is supposed to be part of the segment that focuses in on frameworks, which I partly hope to do, the other that I couldn't resist was to bring in just a snippet from empirical work in India, as opposed to the very European focus that we've been tied to as part of the Engagement Network. So I'll bring up some work from back in up to 2015-16. But first, I thought I would start with something a bit unconventional, taking you through a very close reading of the text that I put down for this, just to kind of not drift from those thoughts. And so I'll literally just read this out to you, but fortunately it's only a couple hundred words. So I wanted to connect the capabilities approach to energy poverty as others have done, but by mainframing development research here, and that's really where I see the capabilities approach as stemming from to begin with in scholarship. As I say, from its roots in development research, some strengths of the capabilities approach are that it recognizes intrinsic value and individual agency among marginalized actors, and it highlights structural constraints to the actualization of inherent capabilities. On the one hand, this engagement with such a grounded approach by energy poverty scholars is natural, given that this epistemic community is concerned about marginalized groups, deprivation, and possibilities to improve energy access with all that this can enable. On the other hand, energy poverty as a concept is not without its critics, for being policy-oriented to a fault, where its proponents risk co-optation of their progressive focus through instrumentarian agenda setting. This makes for a charged entanglement between the capabilities approach and energy poverty research. At its worst, it risks transposing situated agency and contextualized violence to a reductive, metricite agenda, setting the conditions for the proclamation of gains while multi-dimensional vulnerabilities are left unaddressed. And it's most promising. It represents, this merger of the capabilities approach and energy poverty, represents a major advance for constructive engagement, where scholars transcend the domain of societal critique and develop reflexive data infrastructures to unlock human capabilities in targeted and nuanced ways. The current moment is definitive in shaping this crucial trajectory. So there's several points I want to make there, but the main framing, I hope, is clear, even if it's a bit complex. And now I want to take the opportunity to make this come alive through a couple of examples. The first is from being in the Economic and Social Chamber, is it called, the Council of the United Nations, when we last had a review of the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 on clean energy access for all back in 2019. And I remember a representative from UNDP who'd been flown in halfway across the world, kind of remarking, oh, they said I had to come for this, which kind of underscores there's this, what I see as a disjuncture between the worlds of energy policy and energy poverty. And we've come across this in various experiences in our work on Engager as well, where there are people who are jet setting, there are people who are extremely busy and burdened, and these are often the same people making the kinds of crucial decisions that then down the line translate into policy impact through national targets, national policies and commitments, which are not trivial things, but that need to then be translated down into implementation in quite complex and challenging realities. And that's where I want to take you next, to Jharkhand in central eastern India, where I've worked on topics related to resource access, not so much only energy, but during 2012 to 15, 16, in the forests with subsistence agricultural communities, one of the main livelihoods, apart from whenever governments provided local livelihood schemes and manual labor for minimum wage, one of the local livelihoods was chopping wood. Logging was illegal, but it was in practice something every household did to supplement its income. A lot of the income wasn't really monetized. It was bartered, or it was environmental incomes. And so to take a context like that, where people are living hand to mouth, living in the middle of a fair bit of political conflict and violence, where there were insurgent groups battling the state and paramilitary forces levied, I think this brings out the tension between, on the one hand, the focus on individual agency and the need to unlock capabilities versus the structural constraints that I mentioned in the abstract, where we can note a tendency in, and energy poverty has been something that's come up in policy in that region also. We can see a tendency to emphasize certain aspects that seem feasible within the political economic realities. So we see a lot of emphasis typically in that sort of context on clean cook stoves, improving health outcomes, improving the access of particular kinds of actors, women within the household, for instance. What we don't see necessarily is an emphasis on many of the individual agency related aspects that are linked to aspirations. For many people that I worked with, getting a motorcycle was a huge aspiration. Getting a job in coal mining that was, polluting the water resources, that was one of the reasons that their land was under threat. That was something that they would do nonetheless, even if their village had been displaced and their lives thrown asunder, because it was still part of coping with that reality. To what extent are we able to account for those kinds of larger political economic constraints in our engagement with energy poverty as a policy object, as something that gives us a good way in towards impact? And certainly I found my own work something that I would be increasingly frustrated by if I brought forth narratives that would never register at the local or national scale in terms of real world impact. And I think that in that sense, I'm very sympathetic to the possibilities and the commitment of energy poverty scholarship to try and move forward in constructive ways beyond critique, not to dismiss the function of critique, but it surely can't be where, as applied scholars, we stop. That's sort of where we begin to see our relevance. So what are the kinds of things that we could come up with in terms of more nuanced, targeted data infrastructures that allow for informed action? I'll take, on the one hand, the sort of very unnuanced, very broad scoped metric that's often batted about in the Indian context, which is that we have now electrified every village. Electrification being then defined as at least 10% of households and all public buildings having some extent of electricity. And if that's the metric, that then we've solved energy poverty. What have we not solved? We haven't solved that there are power cuts based on political connections. So some villages will get power more of the time than others. Some will get power cuts at a time that's much more inconvenient, whereas others won't, based on various kinds of political connections, payoffs. Other things that we've kind of written out here is how this is closely connected to day-to-day practices, where I'd see groups of men, and it's always men, taking a walk with a whole bunch of mobile phones from their friends to the nearest village a few kilometers away where they could charge them all. Now that is a form of energy poverty that could be addressed. At the same time, there's, conviviality and so on interwoven in it. So it's not to dismiss that, but we need to at least account for these things in our metrics of what the nature of the problem we're trying to target is. Is that something you can fix with leasing models for solar panels for each village at a centralized level? They were putting in electric lines at the same time, right? And the politics around who that burdens, who actually gets them up, when there's the next project, those are things that are much harder to capture in metrics than a simple sort of blanket term like electrification. And the same when we get into problematics of transitioning from coal, what it means to change the regulation around logging. So I won't go into the details, but I hope that it by pulling up sort of an empirical basis, I hope it brings to the fore this tension that we face when trying to connect the kind of pragmatic function of the capabilities approach and energy poverty to the quite challenging realities where there's still lots to be done. Thanks.